My wife announced our divorce in front of her friends at a coffee shop. One table, zero shame, and they all expected me to beg, to plead, to collapse, but instead, I said, "Thanks for the group decision," and walked out, holding screenshots of every secret conversation they'd been planning for months. 7 years of marriage reduced to a rehearsed performance, orchestrated by her friends who nodded along like a jury delivering a verdict. While I sat there silently calculating, I used to think stability was boring, that showing up every day, paying the mortgage on time, and listening when your spouse talked about her dreams was just the baseline of a good marriage, not something that ever needed defending. And for 7 years with Belle, it felt like enough. I was 37, steady, predictable in the best way, the guy who handled the bills while she built her consulting business, the one who believed that ambition and loyalty could live in the same house without fighting each other. And for a long time, they did, because we worked in a way that didn't need applause, just consistency. Until about a year ago when something subtle but unmistakable shifted and the woman who used to curl up beside me on the couch started treating our home like a place she passed through between important things. It started innocently enough with a professional development group, the kind of thing you encourage because you don't want to be the husband who clips his wife's wings. And that's when Kendrick, Sloan, and Zara entered the picture. First as occasional brunch friends, then as a constant chorus in Belle's ear, reinforcing every doubt she'd never voiced to me directly. And suddenly she was coming home later, dressing sharper, talking about leveling up her network like our marriage was an outdated resume bullet she was quietly editing out. I noticed, of course, the way her phone never left her hand, the way she smiled at messages she didn't share, the dinners that ran long and the conferences that seemed to multiply. But after 7 years you don't immediately assume betrayal. You assume stress, growth, phases, anything other than the idea that the person you trusted is slowly outsourcing her respect for you to a committee of friends who barely know you. I told myself it would pass, that marriages ebb and flow, that being steady sometimes means being patient even when you feel the ground shifting under your feet. And then one afternoon Belle texted asking if I could meet her for coffee, casual, almost warm, and for a brief, stupid moment I thought it might be an olive branch, a chance to reconnect like we used to before everything became about optics and energy. So I showed up expecting my wife and instead walked into a scene that felt staged. Belle already seated with Kendrick, Sloan, and Zara, all 4 of them waiting like an intervention panel, eyes lifting in unison as I approached. And in that instant I understood that whatever this meeting was, it wasn't for discussion, it was for delivery. Belle wore that practiced, sympathetic expression people use when they've already made a decision and want credit for being gentle about it. And as I sat down, feeling like the only person without a script, I realized this wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the opening move in something carefully planned, something designed to corner me in public, to control the narrative before I even knew there was one. And as the barista called out orders and strangers typed on laptops around us, I felt the quiet certainty settle in that my life was about to change in a way none of them had fully anticipated, because they mistook my calm for weakness, my silence for ignorance, and they had no idea how dangerous it is to underestimate the person who's been quietly holding everything together. Belle didn't ease into it, because people who plan endings don't linger on beginnings, and the moment I sat down she exhaled like she'd been carrying this for weeks, fingers wrapped tightly around her cup, eyes fixed somewhere just past my shoulder as she said, "This isn't working anymore, the marriage, us, the whole situation." Her hand slicing the air between us like she was clearing space on a whiteboard. And the scrape of Kendrick's chair against the tile came immediately after, her leaning forward with practiced concern, elbows planted, voice steady as she explained that Belle wasn't happy and deserved someone who truly appreciated her growth journey, while Sloan nodded in careful rhythm, adding that it was about matching energy and vision, words delivered with the confidence of someone used to being applauded for insight. And Zara never quite joined the circle at all, thumbs moving on her phone, the screen catching the light as she tilted it, glancing up only long enough to record the scene with her eyes before looking back down, as if my marriage ending were background footage for a later post. The table felt smaller by the second, cups crowding the edge, Belle's knee bouncing under the table while mine stayed still, and I realized I was being watched for a reaction, not by my wife, but by her audience. So when I asked whether this was a group decision my voice didn't rise, didn't crack, and Belle hesitated just long enough for Sloan to straighten and Zara to pause her scrolling. Then she said it was better to end things now before someone got hurt, which landed less like concern and more like a verdict already signed. I asked who he was then, meeting Belle's eyes directly, and the silence that followed was heavy enough to feel Kendrick's jaw tightening, Sloane suddenly fascinated by the foam on her latte, Zara finally looking up with something like annoyance, and Belle shifted back in her chair, folding her arms as she slipped into that condescending calm people use when they think they're explaining something obvious, telling me it wasn't about anyone else, that we just weren't compatible anymore, a word that felt absurd after 7 years of shared routines, shared risks, shared nights talking about the future. They filled the gap with rehearsed affirmations about people evolving and relationships running their course, Kendrick nodding as if she were closing a meeting, Sloane murmuring agreement, Zara smirking faintly like she'd already chosen her side, and it became clear they wanted something from me, anger, pleading, a scene, something they could point to later and say this is why it ended. Instead, I stood, chair legs dragging softly across the floor, felt Belle finally look at me instead of through me, and said, "Thanks for the group decision. Really appreciate the democratic approach," leaving my untouched coffee behind as I walked out, the bell above the door ringing too brightly for the moment. And as I crossed the parking lot I heard Kendrick's voice cut through the glass, loud and sharp, saying I didn't even fight for Belle, that I just walked away like none of it mattered, Sloane agreeing that there was no passion, no effort, and Zara laughing quietly, adding that a real man would have tried, rewriting the moment before it had even cooled. And I paused by my truck long enough to hear them reshape my restraint into apathy. Then I got in and drove, hands steady on the wheel, the shock draining away mile by mile, replaced by a clear, focused awareness. Because the way they'd staged that ambush, the witnesses, the timing, the script, told me this wasn't heartbreak spilling over. It was a controlled demolition, and by the time I pulled into my driveway I understood something fundamental had shifted, not toward saving anything, but toward protecting myself from people who had already decided I was expendable in someone else's reinvention. By the time I pulled back into my driveway, the emotional noise from the coffee shop had burned itself out, leaving behind something colder and far more dangerous, clarity, the kind that arrives when grief realizes it's no longer in control of the situation, when the body stops shaking and the mind starts inventorying. And I remember standing in the kitchen without turning on the lights, jacket still on, listening to the house hum the way it always had, refrigerator clicking on and off, clock ticking steadily, all the normal sounds that suddenly felt like witnesses rather than comforts. Because this wasn't about heartbreak anymore, it was about understanding what had already happened behind my back and why it had been staged the way it was. Belle hadn't asked for a conversation, she hadn't shown uncertainty or fear, and her friends hadn't reacted like people improvising in the moment. They'd been prepared, positioned, aligned. Which meant the coffee shop wasn't an emotional outburst but the final act of something already decided. And that realization shifted everything. Because you don't heal from a plan, you respond to it. I sat at the kitchen table and replayed details I'd ignored earlier. Kendrick's timing, Sloane's phrasing, Zara's phone angled just slightly upward, not to film exactly but to be ready. The way Belle never once asked how I felt or what I wanted, only announced a conclusion like a verdict already ratified elsewhere. And suddenly her recent behavior snapped into focus, the late nights framed as networking, the sudden emphasis on growth and alignment, the subtle withdrawal from shared decisions, the way she'd stopped arguing and started narrating instead, as if I were already an audience member in my own marriage. That's when Cade surfaced in my thoughts, not dramatically, not like a movie reveal, but as a quiet constant I'd mentally filed away months earlier. The guy with the effortless confidence and inherited ease. The one who always seemed to be at the same events Belle attended, who laughed a little too comfortably with her, whose name appeared casually in stories that never quite added up. And I realized the ambush hadn't been designed to hurt me emotionally but to neutralize me psychologically, to make me reactive, embarrassed, isolated. So I'd walk away without asking questions or checking accounts or noticing patterns. I didn't pour a drink or collapse on the couch or text anyone for reassurance. Instead, I opened my laptop and stared at the screen without touching the keyboard for a long moment, letting the situation fully assemble itself in my head. Because once you accept that people are acting with intention, you stop assuming innocence and start tracking consistency. And consistency always leaves trails. I wasn't angry yet, not in the explosive sense, and I wasn't sad in the way that begs for comfort. I was alert. The same feeling I get before a difficult project or a long drive at night, when you know fatigue is dangerous and attention is everything. And I understood then that whatever Belle and her friends thought they'd orchestrated, they'd misjudged the quiet part of me, the part that listens more than it speaks, that notices more than it reacts, the part that pays the bills, reads the fine print, and doesn't confuse silence for weakness. The marriage might have ended in a coffee shop, but the situation itself was far from over. And as I finally placed my hands on the keyboard, not yet typing but ready to, I wasn't thinking about saving anything or winning anything or proving anything. I was thinking about rules, leverage, and sequence. Because once a situation turns strategic, emotions don't disappear, they just stop being in charge. And that was the moment I understood I wasn't dealing with heartbreak anymore, I was dealing with a coordinated move. And coordination only works if the other side never starts paying attention. Sitting at the kitchen table, iPad in hand and laptop open, the room felt simultaneously familiar and alien. The hum of the refrigerator and the ticking wall clock anchoring me as I began to trace the threads that Belle and her friends had woven around my life. Starting with Cade, the trust fund consultant whose Portia had made casual appearances at networking events, now revealing him as a central node in the scheme. And as I scrolled through messages, bank statements, and hotel charges, a clear pattern emerged. Each dinner, each late-night call, each fabricated excuse fit into a meticulous timeline that they had choreographed like a play I was only just discovering. The squad's group texts acting as meeting minutes for a strategy one hadn't been invited to, Kendrick pushing for timing, Sloan advising on optics, Zara suggesting the coffee shop because public settings favored them, Belle coordinating everything under the guise of casual conversation, all of it recorded on screens that glowed with cold certainty. And with every screenshot I took, every folder I backed up to multiple cloud drives, the fog of shock shifted into the clarity of preparation. Because understanding their moves meant I could plan mine, I reviewed her credit cards, 6 feeding off the joint account like parasites, subscriptions and expenses lining up with the same nights she claimed to be at conferences. And the spreadsheet I created told a story no conversation could dispute, a pattern of deceit, opportunism, and premeditation. And as I catalogued hotel charges, restaurant bills, and unexplained purchases, the abstract betrayal became tangible, actionable, and the calmness of methodical documentation gave me the first sense of control in weeks. The power of knowing exactly what had been done and when it had been done, while simultaneously confirming the motivations behind the coffee shop ambush, the rehearsed expressions, the rehearsed words. And I realized that what I had previously perceived as chance or coincidence was deliberate strategy, a networked effort to dismantle my marriage and rewrite my personal narrative without my knowledge. I paused only to breathe, not out of emotional overwhelm but to maintain perspective, then returned to the iPad, scrolling past Cade's flirtations, Belle's compliance, and Kendrick's nudges, realizing that the people she presented as supportive friends were in fact co-conspirators. Ensuring that my wife's departure was framed not as betrayal but as evolution. And every detail, every timestamp, every carefully archived image became a piece of evidence that would shape my response. The rules of engagement no longer unspoken, the battlefield clearly marked. And in that moment the story shifted entirely, no longer about heartbreak, no longer about pleading or explaining, but about understanding, documenting, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Knowing that every action from this point forward would be deliberate, measured, and informed by the undeniable trail they had left behind. Because clarity breeds strategy, and strategy, unlike emotion, can't be undone. The next morning, with the coffee cooling beside me and sunlight creeping across the kitchen counter, I began the painstaking work of cataloging Belle's betrayal, each document, message, and charge like a breadcrumb trail she had carelessly left for me to follow. Starting with the shared iPad that held months of unsentimental truths, messages to Cade brimming with familiarity and inside jokes, discussions about when and how she would exit the marriage, and the way her friends, the squad, actively coordinated every detail, timestamps and receipts lining up in a pattern that was almost cinematic in its precision. And as I scrolled through each exchange, screenshots piling up on my desktop and cloud drives, I could see the architecture of their deception. Hotel stays on nights she claimed to be at work, long phone calls under the guise of client meetings, restaurant bills from places she never mentioned, all pointing to an affair that wasn't just opportunistic but meticulously planned. And yet the process wasn't just about gathering proof, it was a study in methodical restraint, measuring what she thought was hidden against what was plainly visible if one looked carefully enough, observing how the squad manipulated narrative, offering lines for her to recite, shaping her story for maximum public impact. The coffee shop group decision, no longer an emotional ambush but a calculated maneuver. And as I catalogued every financial transaction, credit card charge, and subscription, the abstract sting of betrayal crystallized into a concrete record of actions, the pattern of deceit no longer intangible but quantifiable. And with each new piece of evidence, my calm steadied, because knowing the truth, documenting it, understanding it, gave me the power to respond rather than react. And I noticed subtler cues, the way Belle's voice shifted in texts, the small arrogance in the squad's advice, the rehearsed concern that had masqueraded as empathy, the tiny gaps in her stories, all captured, all stored, all ready to speak for themselves when the time came. And as the hours passed, I realized that my role had transformed, from husband blindsided to investigator, from observer to strategist, every action measured, every screenshot a soldier in an army of accountability, and the mundane items, the iPad, the phone bills, the receipts, suddenly became instruments of control, each revealing more than just infidelity but a network of manipulation. And as I backed up the final folder and set aside my coffee, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not of triumph over emotion, but of readiness, the battlefield mapped, the evidence undeniable, and in that moment, the story ceased to be about heartbreak and became about preparation. Every piece of betrayal catalogued, every act recorded, because strategy demands clarity, clarity demands discipline, and discipline ensures that when the confrontation comes, it will not be a scene of chaos but a demonstration of facts, consequences, and unshakable resolve, with nothing left to chance and everything accounted for. With the morning sun cutting through the blinds, I settled at the kitchen table, iPad open, laptop ready, and a steaming cup of coffee as my silent witness, ready to assemble the arsenal that would turn months of deception into undeniable evidence. The air was quiet, deceptively calm, but inside, a storm of calculation had already begun, each piece of data a weapon, each message, call log, and credit card statement a fragment of a story Belle and her friends had tried to script. And now it was mine to narrate truthfully, objectively, and methodically. Starting with the hotel receipts from weekends she claimed to be working, timestamps lining up against text messages with Cade, every exchange punctuated with inside jokes, flirtation, and planning that betrayed the care with which she had choreographed the coffee shop ambush, while simultaneously maintaining a facade of the dutiful wife. And as I scanned the late-night calls to Cade, noting patterns, repeated hours, and untraceable excuses, I realized this wasn't impulsive, it was strategic, deliberate, rehearsed, and the squad's coordination only confirmed the meticulous nature of the betrayal, sending messages like puppeteers from behind screens, nudging, scripting, and cajoling Belle into a public performance of heartbreak at my expense. And I catalogued each financial transaction, cross-referenced every charge, highlighting discrepancies, overpayments, and unexplained luxuries. Every spreadsheet cell a silent accusation, while the mundane details, the shared iPad, household subscriptions, and cloud backups, became instruments of clarity, providing timestamps and context that would stand unassailable in court. And as I moved through the messages, noticing shifts in tone, carefully choreographed excuses, and subtle bragging, I realized I was no longer just an observer. I had become a strategist, turning emotion into evidence, and preparation into leverage, measuring every action, noting every misstep, and ensuring that when the confrontation came, it would be anchored in truth, not sentiment. While the text strings from the squad, Kendrick, Sloan, and Zara, revealed themselves as more than commentary, they were active collaborators in a scheme, guiding, manipulating, and enforcing a narrative they believed I would never unravel. And as I captured screenshots, downloaded PDFs, and backed up every file, I felt a quiet steadiness, the kind that comes from knowing every detail, every lie, every hidden agenda is accounted for, leaving nothing to interpretation. While the coffee cooled and shadows lengthened across the room, I realized this meticulous cataloging was not just preparation for confrontation, it was armor against chaos, a way to reclaim control. And as the day waned, the realization solidified that knowledge, methodical and complete, was the most powerful weapon of all, because in documenting the betrayal with precision, I had converted what had been a deeply personal wound into an unassailable record, ready for whatever came next. And in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by screens, spreadsheets, and proof, the path forward became clear, every action calculated, every consequence anticipated, and every piece of evidence ready to speak louder than emotion ever could. The morning of reckoning arrived with a quiet tension that belied the storm about to erupt. I moved through the house deliberately, each step measured, eyes scanning the living room, the office, and the kitchen where Belle had once lingered with coffee in hand. Remnants of ordinary life now a backdrop for an extraordinary confrontation. And when I opened the door to find her car in the driveway, a flash of rehearsed composure crossed her face, quickly replaced by subtle panic as she realized I was ready, that nothing about this encounter would follow her script. And as she stepped out, 2 black trash bags clutched in her hands, her expression flickered between indignation, disbelief, and barely contained fury, and I calmly instructed, "Everything packed. Take it, nothing else moves." The words steady, leaving no room for negotiation, while Cade hovered awkwardly, attempting to insert himself with a nervous, "Maybe I should," before I interrupted, "You're not involved. Step back." And he retreated, boldness evaporating in the presence of consequence, leaving Belle exposed, her mask faltering as I reminded her that every transaction, every late-night call, every hotel stay, every hidden expense had been recorded, backed up, and verified, evidence that could not be rewritten. And as she flailed briefly, "I can't just, this isn't fair," I replied evenly, "The records speak for themselves," letting her frustration crash against the wall of irrefutable documentation, while the morning air thickened with tension, shadows stretching across the driveway like the final curtain on her carefully choreographed plan. And as she loaded her bags into Cade's car, hands trembling, pride and panic battling across her face, I felt the tangible manifestation of preparation transform into action. The first strike complete, a public assertion of control executed without theatrics, begging, or panic. And as the car pulled away, I stood in the doorway, the sun casting long, deliberate shadows, a symbolic clearing of the path forward, understanding that personal betrayal had been converted into power through strategy and discipline. And in that moment, the first visible victory crystallized. A testament that measured resolve, calm authority, and meticulous planning always outlast manipulation, impulsiveness, and hubris, leaving the audience both satisfied with the payoff and eager for the next escalation in the unfolding confrontation. After Belle and Cade drove off, the house felt almost impossibly quiet, the hum of the fridge and the faint morning birdsong now underscoring a new kind of order. I walked through each room, systematically checking the locks, confirming that every personal item, every piece of documentation, every digital record was secure, and in that meticulous process, I realized the depth of the calm I could cultivate when chaos had been preempted, because I had done the work others ignored, and the clarity of the plan I'd followed crystallized in every measured movement, each step a reaffirmation that I was no longer reactive but in control, that nothing in my life, no betrayal, no theatrics, no attempts at manipulation, would dictate the rhythm of my decisions again. And yet, even in this victory, I remained acutely aware that containment wasn't passive, that real power lay not just in action but in anticipation. So I scanned our bank statements, cross-checked credit cards, documented subscriptions, and organized emails in ways Belle could never hope to disrupt, noting anomalies, late-night charges, patterns of deception, each one feeding the narrative of betrayal I could now prove. And as I worked, my mind reconstructed the coffee shop ambush, the rehearsed lines of her friends, the smug certainty of Cade, and I felt the weight of 7 years' stability contrasted against months of clandestine plotting, realizing that preparation had given me a vantage point she could not penetrate, a psychological and practical buffer that would turn her missteps into evidence. And then my phone buzzed, a call from a lawyer confirming the backup copies were accessible, secure, and admissible, and I felt a quiet satisfaction. The kind that comes from knowing you've built a fortress of facts, ready to withstand challenge, criticism, or theatrics. And while this wasn't about vengeance, it was about accountability, clarity, and ensuring that the narrative would be told accurately, that no dramatics, no manipulations, and no public performances could overshadow reality. And as I set the final spreadsheet, backed up every screenshot to 3 separate clouds, and labeled every folder with timestamps. I realized that containment was more than physical, it was a state of mind, a principle of measured authority, and as I looked out the window, seeing the empty driveway, I felt the first true sense of relief, a moment of pause before the storm of legal proceedings and emotional fallout, understanding fully that the work done in quiet diligence now gave me power over chaos, and that Belle's theatrics, her plans, and her allies had been neutralized by preparation, foresight, and calm decisiveness, leaving the audience aware that the protagonist is no longer simply enduring betrayal but actively controlling the environment, shaping outcomes, and setting the stage for the confrontation and justice to come, creating suspense and anticipation for the next chapter in this cinematic journey. By the 9th day after the coffee shop, the chaos had fully burned away, replaced by a rhythm that felt almost unsettling in its calm, because this was no longer about reacting to what Belle had done but about positioning myself for what she would inevitably try next. And every morning began the same way, coffee untouched beside my laptop, blinds half open, light cutting across spreadsheets, screenshots, call logs, and timelines that now told a coherent story instead of a painful one, a story with motive, sequence, and intent that no amount of rewriting could undo. I wasn't obsessing anymore, I was organizing, condensing, reducing months of betrayal into clear lines that anyone with authority could follow. And that shift mattered because confusion protects liars while clarity corners them. And Belle had built her entire exit strategy on the assumption that I would stay confused, emotional, slow. I consolidated files into labeled folders, not because I enjoyed the process but because structure is what turns suspicion into leverage. And as I worked, I noticed how often she and her circle had underestimated the boring details, assuming emotions would overwhelm logistics, that shock would replace scrutiny, that I'd be too embarrassed to look closely at my own life once they'd reframed the narrative publicly. A text from my attorney came in mid-morning, short, precise, asking me to resend the bank statements and phone records in a single PDF rather than separate attachments, and that small interaction grounded everything in reality, a reminder that this wasn't theoretical anymore, that professionals were now involved. People who spoke in evidence and outcomes rather than feelings. And when I sent the file back, neatly indexed, I felt the first genuine sense of momentum since the ambush. Belle hadn't called again, which told me more than any argument would have. Because silence from someone who thrives on control isn't peace, it's recalibration, and I knew she was regrouping, likely with Kendrick and Sloan, likely rehearsing explanations, likely convinced that whatever I was doing couldn't matter because she still believed this was about emotional fallout rather than structural exposure. I took a walk that afternoon, not to clear my head but to test it, to see if anger or grief would hijack my thoughts now that the immediate danger had passed. And what surprised me wasn't how calm I felt but how focused, how the narrative had shifted internally from loss to logistics, from betrayal to consequence. And I realized that the most dangerous moment for someone who manipulates situations is when the other party stops asking why and starts asking how. Back home, I reviewed the material again, not compulsively but critically, trimming redundancies, highlighting patterns, making sure nothing relied on interpretation alone, because interpretation invites debate while patterns end it, and I caught myself almost smiling at how predictable the arc had become, the public declaration, the moral framing, the quiet financial bleed, the reliance on social reinforcement, all of it textbook once you step far enough back. That evening, another message came through, this time from a colleague checking in, vague but cautious, clearly responding to something Belle had already begun seeding socially, and instead of responding defensively, I saved the message, noting the timing, the phrasing, the way concern was being preloaded before any formal conflict emerged. Because reputations aren't destroyed in courtrooms first, they're softened in whispers, and Belle was already moving there. I didn't confront her, didn't warn her, didn't try to correct the story, because preparation isn't loud and control doesn't announce itself, and by the time I shut down my laptop that night, everything I needed was already in place, not to strike impulsively or dramatically but to wait, because the people who believe they've already won are always the ones who move next without checking the board. And I understood with quiet certainty that whatever Belle planned to do to finish this cleanly would be the very thing that exposed how unclean it actually was. By mid-morning, the quiet of my home was electric with purpose. My laptop hummed, screens filled with rows of evidence I had cataloged over the past weeks, each text, email, and receipt now a thread in the tapestry of betrayal I was ready to lay bare. And as I organized screenshots into chronological folders and cross-referenced hotel charges with her fabricated schedules, my phone buzzed with a call from my attorney, brief and procedural, confirming subpoenas had been issued and legal notices prepared. A reminder that the strategic groundwork I had meticulously laid was now transitioning from observation to action, that the internal discipline I had cultivated in solitude would now have external consequences, and I felt a rare surge of calm satisfaction knowing that each deliberate step was backed by documentation, timing, and foresight, leaving no room for ambiguity or counternarrative. While the digital universe of evidence unfolded before me, I moved through the physical realm with equal purpose, double-checking accounts, confirming credit card statements, and securing shared assets. The hum of the refrigerator, distant traffic, and the faint click of my keyboard anchoring each movement in a rhythm of precise, methodical action. And in between these tasks, I allowed brief windows for reflection, noticing the small domestic details, a dust mote catching sunlight, the warmth of the coffee cup, the faint aroma of toast, as subtle reminders that life continued even amidst the storm of manipulation and deceit. That grounding myself in the tangible reinforced my mental clarity, and as I finished cross-referencing an email chain that aligned perfectly with the hotel receipts, a text arrived from a colleague asking if everything was okay after recent office rumors. I responded briefly, carefully, maintaining professional calm, reinforcing the duality of my life now, where outward normalcy concealed an inner engine of strategy, and the confirmation that HR inquiries were underway, coupled with the subpoenaed evidence, made it clear that the upcoming confrontation was inevitable, that Bell's orchestrated plans could no longer hide behind performance or theatrics. And as I sat back, reviewing a final spreadsheet correlating financial activity, hotel stays, and her clandestine communications with Cade and her friends, I felt a definitive shift. The passive period of shock and disbelief was over, replaced by an active, controlled phase where facts, law, and planning would dictate outcomes. And the anticipation of her reaction, her realization that the coffee shop ambush and subsequent manipulations were now irrelevant in the face of proof, charged the air like static, making the silence in the house a stage for the cinematic exposure about to unfold. A moment where methodical preparation, strategic foresight, and meticulous documentation would converge to enforce accountability, restore equilibrium, and demonstrate that betrayal, no matter how well choreographed, cannot outmaneuver deliberate action, leaving the audience poised on the edge of discovery, eager to witness how patience, intelligence, and evidence will transform deception into undeniable consequence. The morning after finalizing the organization of every shred of evidence, I moved through my home with a deliberate calm, aware that the world outside remained oblivious to the storm I had quietly built. Sunlight poured through the kitchen window, illuminating the spreadsheets and screenshots arranged neatly on my desk, each one a frozen moment of betrayal. Yet as I sipped my coffee and let the warmth settle in my hands, I allowed myself to observe small domestic details, a bird landing on the windowsill, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of floorboards under my weight, which anchored me in the present and reminded me that life was continuing even as I prepared for confrontation. And I methodically reviewed every text, email, and transaction one final time, checking timestamps, cross-referencing hotel charges with her fabricated schedules, confirming that nothing could contradict the narrative I had now fully documented, while periodically my phone buzzed with minor work updates or alerts from my attorney confirming court filings, each one a small rhythm in the day that punctuated the quiet tension. And I made notes on potential objections, mapped out anticipated denials, and considered the precise phrasing for each point of confrontation, mentally rehearsing each moment so that when Belle and her allies realized the full scope of their exposure, there would be no room for improvisation, no escape from accountability. Yet even in this meticulous planning, I allowed moments of ordinary life to intrude, a laugh from a neighbor's child, a stray breeze carrying the scent of cut grass through the open window, which served as reminders that the stakes, though high, were manageable when approached with clarity. And I briefly glanced at the calendar, noting court dates, deadlines for evidence submission, and potential windows for deposition, visualizing the sequence of events as a chain of dominoes that I had positioned with patience and precision, while mentally preparing for any unforeseen escalation. including Belle attempting to manipulate colleagues or mutual acquaintances in the coming days, and I practiced maintaining composure in the face of provocation, reinforcing the mental discipline that had carried me this far, knowing that the first visible confrontation, the moment I presented irrefutable evidence, would set the tone for every subsequent interaction. And as the afternoon sun shifted across the room, casting long shadows over the desk strewn with documentation, I paused to breathe, feeling the tension accumulate, aware that this quiet phase was fleeting but essential, that preparation, patience, and controlled observation were the weapons I wielded while the world assumed the drama had already passed, and I understood that once action was initiated, every calculated step, every documented truth, every carefully preserved message would converge to demonstrate not anger, not revenge, but unassailable clarity and authority, leaving Belle and her network exposed in a way that no argument, denial, or misdirection could counter. And as evening approached, I sat back, letting the weight of impending confrontation settle over me like a tangible presence, knowing that in a few short days, months of deceit and manipulation would be met with structured consequence. The calm before the storm now at its peak, a tension so cinematic it could be felt in the hum of the lights, the tick of the clock, and the quiet certainty that every element had been accounted for, leaving the viewer poised, expectant, and ready to witness the collision of evidence, strategy, and inevitable reckoning. By the morning of the planned confrontation, the house felt charged, almost electric, every surface a reminder of the methodical preparation that had brought me to this point. I moved through the rooms with deliberate calm, checking that each piece of evidence was in order, spreadsheets aligned, screenshots labeled, hotel receipts cross-referenced, and messages backed up, a quiet ritual that sharpened my focus while outside the sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the driveway, illuminating details I usually ignored but that now seemed to underscore the tension of the day ahead. And as I sipped my coffee, I replayed the sequence in my mind, the coffee shop ambush, the rehearsed lines from Belle's friends, her sudden composure that barely masked the discomfort of her own deceit, and I visualized her face when the first undeniable proof appeared, imagining the micro-expressions that would betray panic, shame, or anger, because preparation wasn't just about documentation, it was about orchestrating clarity, creating a reality where facts, timing, and evidence would converge so cleanly that no manipulation could survive. And I reviewed the logistics, making sure that when Belle arrived, the sequence would unfold seamlessly, the trash bags at the door, the items accounted for, the entry blocked, Cade's role neutralized, and the camera of the mind capturing every reaction. Because in this moment, I wasn't just protecting property, I was asserting control over narrative, ensuring that the truth would emerge unfiltered, undeniable, and public if necessary. And as noon approached, I noticed small triggers around the house, the ticking of the wall clock, the hum of the fridge, the creak of a floorboard underfoot, all grounding me in the rhythm of anticipation. While outside, the neighbor's lawn glowed under the sun, the breeze carrying faint sounds of distant cars and occasional chatter, reminders that normal life continued even as I prepared for the extraordinary. And then the headlights appeared in the driveway, familiar yet loaded with tension, the Porsche glinting in the sun as Belle pulled up, already rehearsed expressions flickering across her face, a mix of indignation, surprise, and the faintest shadow of fear. And I opened the door, standing firm, unflinching, while the trash bags and documentation behind me silently signaled that the rules had changed, that negotiation would no longer be verbal or reliant on charm. And as she stepped out, I calmly explained that everything was accounted for, that only what was legally hers had been separated, and that trespassing by Cade or friends would not be tolerated, observing her reactions with the same precision I had used to catalog every text, every call, every concealed plan. Because in this first strike, the objective wasn't revenge but clarity, a demonstration that deceit had limits, that manipulation and coordinated deception could be met with methodical, undeniable consequence. And as she hesitated, fumbling with her rehearsed victim posture, I maintained control, mentally recording every flicker of expression, every shaky hand, every hesitation, knowing that this display of measured authority was more potent than any argument or pleading she could offer. And when the bags were finally loaded, when Cade was sent to wait outside, when the door closed behind her, the sense of achievement wasn't triumphal, it was quiet, resolute, the satisfaction of seeing meticulous preparation meet execution, the first strike landing cleanly, irreversible in its precision, leaving the audience, the viewer, and myself aware that from this moment, the trajectory of consequence had been set, and every future action would flow from this first, decisive, methodical confrontation. The days after uncovering Belle's orchestrated betrayal felt like walking through a minefield where every text, every email, every late-night call I had documented became a trigger, a reminder that while she had plotted and executed with precision, I had the advantage of foresight and evidence, and I moved deliberately, cataloging, backing up, and cross-referencing every scrap of proof, every photo of receipts, every message with Cade, Kendrick, Sloan, and Zara, so that nothing could be dismissed or denied. Each screenshot was a small hammer blow shaping a narrative they had thought they controlled, and I could almost hear Belle's rehearsed lines echoing in my mind as I arranged the evidence. "It's not about anyone else," she had said, but the very documents in front of me proved otherwise, and as I compiled hotel receipts, credit card charges, and messages that chronicled months of deception, I felt the tension shift from internal shock to strategic clarity, knowing that the public coffee shop humiliation was only the overture to a carefully orchestrated reveal, that the friends who had acted as chorus members in the drama were themselves expendable pieces in a larger tableau I was now directing. And while I double-checked timestamps and synced iCloud histories, I imagined how each piece of data would land in court, how the judge and lawyers would parse the sequence of lies, the hidden rendezvous, the financial maneuvering, and the manipulations that had been executed with astonishing audacity. And I realized the gravity of transformation from a betrayed husband to an active strategist, that this was no longer personal grief but a demonstration of methodical intelligence, of how meticulous documentation converts chaos into leverage, of how preparation can turn humiliation into vindication. I paused only to watch Belle attempt another call, blocked before she could even leave a message, and I imagined her frustration, the pivot from smug triumph to disbelief as the realization dawned that her years of planning could now be weaponized against her. And I felt no glee, only the clarity of inevitability, the slow, cinematic unfolding of consequence that she had ignored, dismissed, or thought she controlled. And as the day faded into evening, I prepared the next steps: legal consultation, structuring evidence packages, notifying relevant parties while maintaining my composure in a way that no one, not Belle, not Cade, not her enablers, could anticipate. I envisioned the courtroom, the procedural rhythm of discovery, the meticulous reading of texts and receipts that would leave no room for misinterpretation, no loophole for excuse, the public narrative shifting from betrayal to accountability, and I could already hear the whispered recalibrations among her friends, the gasps at how carefully their orchestration had been documented, their previous confidence replaced with a creeping unease. And in this quiet before confrontation, I felt the power of patience, of methodical accumulation, of the slow burn that turns private knowledge into undeniable truth. And as night fell and I sat surrounded by digital and physical records, I understood that the story had now changed its axis. Belle was no longer in control, Cade's fleeting audacity was meaningless, the so-called squad was impotent, and I held in my hands the evidence that would not only secure justice but reveal the full scope of their deception. And I finally allowed myself a measured breath, the calm of someone who had turned shock and betrayal into strategic clarity, knowing that in the coming days, every carefully laid plan, every documented lie, every collected proof would converge into a reckoning both inevitable and irrevocable. And with that thought, I closed my laptop, the digital fortress secure, the narrative now fully mine, and the stage set for exposure. The morning after securing and backing up every piece of evidence, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity, as though the 7 years of marriage, the betrayal, and the carefully orchestrated coffee shop ambush had compressed time into a single, sharp focus where every decision now mattered. And while Belle probably believed she was still in control, planning her next move, calculating reactions, sending silent signals through her friends, I was methodical, deliberate, cataloging hotel receipts, late-night calls, and credit card charges, cross-referencing dates and times, creating an almost cinematic timeline that left no room for misinterpretation. And I could almost see her pacing, her rehearsed victim act waiting for someone to admire, for me to plead or falter. But I had moved past instinctive emotion into strategic calculation, knowing that any misstep could squander the leverage painstakingly built over weeks of observation and evidence collection. And so I mapped every potential encounter, every possible confrontation, every chance that Bell or Cade might attempt to manipulate perception, and I imagined the public exposure, the courtroom, the silent reading of texts and receipts, and how each line of evidence would speak louder than any argument, how each photograph, each screenshot would dismantle the carefully constructed narrative she thought she controlled. And while physically my house seemed quiet, just the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the floorboards, the distant chatter of neighbors beginning their day, mentally the tension was palpable, a rhythmic undercurrent of anticipation and preparation. And I allowed myself one brief glance at the iPad, still synced to Bell's iCloud, to ensure nothing had changed. No new messages had slipped in unnoticed. No subtle maneuver had been enacted while I slept. And as I sipped coffee and reviewed bank statements once again, I catalogued small patterns, noticing repeated charges, hidden subscriptions, and discrepancies that illustrated both her disregard for transparency and the depth of premeditation. And I realized that while she thought the coffee shop ambush was the climax, it had only been the opening act. And now I held the cards, the knowledge, the strategy, and the patience to escalate in a controlled, undeniable way. And while most of the world would see only headlines, social media posts, and fragmented narratives, I knew the full story, months of planning, deception, and betrayal compressed into tangible evidence, ready to be revealed at the right time. And as the day progressed, I maintained a steady outward composure, answered work emails, kept routine tasks on track, all while running mental simulations of confrontation, every possible response, every countermove, ensuring that when the moment arrived, there would be no surprises, no chance for manipulation, no wiggle room for excuse or denial. And as evening approached, I considered the timing, the logistics, even the arrival of lawyers and the precise sequence of document handovers, feeling a calm that only comes from total preparation, a quiet anticipation of the moment where patience, foresight, and meticulous cataloging of truth converge. And I realized that this quiet, methodical day, seemingly uneventful to anyone observing, was the fulcrum of all that was to come, the pivot point where the private reckoning would transition into public exposure. And while Belle and her friends probably imagined me immobilized by shock or grief, I was in control, every detail documented, every contingency planned, every subtle tension accounted for. And as night fell, I closed the iPad, glanced at the organized stacks of evidence on the table, and understood that this calm before the storm was the true power, silent, patient, deliberate, and utterly irreversible. The next morning, I awoke with a clear sense of purpose, knowing that today marked the first deliberate step from preparation to execution, the moment where months of cataloging, screenshotting, and tracking would finally converge into tangible action. And I moved through my routine with deliberate calm, coffee in hand, reviewing spreadsheets of transactions, cross-referencing hotel stays, credit card activity, late-night calls, and the iCloud messages that mapped Belle's duplicity in vivid detail, every line a confirmation of what I had suspected, every timestamp a calculated betrayal. And as I organized the documents into neat piles for my lawyers, the doorbell rang, momentary disruption that reminded me the world outside didn't know the war unfolding within these walls. And I allowed myself a measured pause, noting the precise timing, the sound of footsteps on the porch, the hum of traffic outside, the distant echo of a neighbor's dog, sensory anchors that kept me grounded while my mind remained fully occupied with the strategy. And soon my legal team arrived, briefcases and tablets in hand, expressions of controlled intensity as they absorbed the meticulously gathered evidence, flipping through screenshots, spreadsheets, bank statements, and messages, every document reinforcing the story I had long since internalized. And we mapped out the sequence of action. Belle would be served, her friend's involvement documented, every claim of innocence countered with proof, every lie undone by fact. And the first meeting was scheduled, lawyers positioned, arrival times synchronized, the orchestration precise, almost cinematic in its quiet confidence. And while Belle likely believed she had engineered the narrative in her favor, I knew that as each text, each receipt, each late-night call was presented, the weight of accumulated truth would be undeniable. And I envisioned her expressions shifting from casual dismissal to mounting panic, the careful mask of victimhood cracking under the inevitability of evidence. And as we transported files, double-checked entries, and confirmed timelines, I imagined the courtroom as a stage, every email a line, every bank statement a spotlight, the audience composed of legal professionals, judges, and my own sense of vindication, each piece of documentation contributing to the clarity of the story. And even as I remained outwardly composed, a pulse of anticipation ran through me, measured and controlled, not impatience but readiness. And the day progressed with methodical efficiency, documents served, procedures followed, lawyers confirming receipt, every interaction reinforcing the unassailable position I now occupied. And while Belle might have anticipated resistance, surprise, tears, or negotiation, I offered none, just a quiet adherence to the plan, every move deliberate, every moment calculated. And as the final documents were handed over, I felt the release of tension in knowing that preparation had translated into action, strategy into reality, and for the first time in months, the pendulum had shifted entirely in my favor, not through passion, not through confrontation, but through methodical documentation, patience, and the precise application of consequence. And as I watched my lawyers leave, files in hand, fully briefed on every contingency, I realized that this first strike, silent and systematic, had set in motion the unraveling of deceit, the exposure of betrayal, and the reclamation of control, all achieved without a word of pleading, without a single emotional collapse. And while Belle's network may have expected chaos or capitulation, all they witnessed was calm, deliberate action, the quiet power of preparation finally meeting the world. And I understood that this was not revenge, not spectacle, but the inevitable correction of imbalance, the first in a series of steps that would ensure truth, accountability, and the final restoration of order. The following weeks unfolded with a mixture of procedural calm and relentless momentum, each day a new layer of clarity as my legal team systematically presented the evidence we had meticulously gathered, and I watched from a measured distance, knowing that every text, every hotel receipt, every late-night call, and every bank statement was a thread in the tapestry of deception that Belle and her so-called friends had woven. And as the divorce filings moved through the court system, each subpoenaed message and transaction turned into undeniable proof, exposing not only her affair with Cade but also the premeditated coordination with Kendrick, Sloan, and Zara, the public coffee shop ambush, the planning of timelines, and the choreographing of appearances, all documented and undeniable. And while Belle likely imagined herself clever and untouchable, the reality was starkly different. Her social network crumbled under scrutiny, Kendrick began deflecting blame, Zara withdrew into silence, and Sloan forced her to confront the consequences of her manipulation, the friend group dissolving in parallel with the collapse of her strategy. And as the legal proceedings advanced, her attempts to paint me as controlling, petty, or vindictive were systematically dismantled with hard evidence. From financial records proving I had maintained the mortgage and paid bills during her absences, to the clear documentation of client meetings that never happened, late-night communications with Cade, and detailed logs of her premeditated betrayal, each piece meticulously cross-referenced and presented in a way that left no room for doubt. And the court's response was decisive: full recognition of my claims, affirmation of asset division fairness, acknowledgement of malicious HR interference, and formal validation that her actions had real-world consequences, including temporary setbacks in her consulting career, delayed promotions, and a professional reputation tarnished by publicly documented misconduct. And as the dust settled, Belle found herself stripped of the protective veneer of her friend network, the affair partner long gone, the manipulations fully exposed, and her attempts to control the narrative in public channels rendered impotent by the objective record we had compiled. And I watched as each post, each attempt at self-justification, each vague social media statement was countered by factual evidence, leaving her isolated, accountable, and, ultimately, unable to escape the consequences of her choices, while I moved forward with quiet satisfaction, not celebration, understanding that justice, preparation, and careful strategy had produced a resolution far more effective than any impulsive confrontation could have achieved. And as the final hearings concluded, the judge's ruling secured my financial stability, confirmed my professional integrity, and established a clear boundary between past and future, leaving Belle with only the remnants of her decisions, a fractured social circle, a diminished professional trajectory, and the full comprehension that manipulation, deceit, and attempts to weaponize others against truth and fairness carry weighty repercussions. And in the calm aftermath, I finally allowed myself to breathe, the house quiet, the coffee steaming, the grandfather's watch resting beside me, and the clarity of regained control settling like sunlight across the living room. Proof that patience, meticulous attention to detail, and unwavering adherence to facts can turn betrayal into structured resolution, deception into clarity, and personal devastation into methodical restoration. A final chapter written not in anger or revenge, but in the undeniable language of evidence, accountability, and the quiet strength of measured action. With the dust finally settling, I found myself in a home that no longer carried the weight of deceit, betrayal, or constant calculation, a space that had once been the stage of manipulation now quiet, familiar, and entirely under my control. The lingering tension of months of evidence gathering, legal maneuvering, and careful observation giving way to a rare, almost disarming sense of calm, the kind that arrives only when chaos has been fully accounted for and every contingency anticipated. And as I sat at the kitchen table with my grandfather's pocket watch ticking softly beside my coffee, I allowed myself to reflect not on the wrongs done to me, but on the lessons carved from them, the importance of patience, preparation, and maintaining integrity in the face of provocation, the understanding that betrayal often reveals character more than the act itself, and that the quiet, steady presence I had cultivated over years was, in the end, a far more powerful force than any public display of anger or despair. And life moved forward in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, emails cleared, phone notifications silenced, personal belongings organized, the lingering presence of the past reduced to files and records safely stored. And as the first weekend in months arrived, Natalie appeared, her smile easy, unguarded, and genuine, a reminder that life's next chapter need not be encumbered by the wreckage left behind, and our laughter over a simple dinner, unburdened by drama or performance, felt like a reclamation of normalcy, a return to a rhythm where joy was simple and immediate, where connection was authentic, and where the ghosts of betrayal held no sway over the present. And in the following days, small victories compounded, legal finalities confirmed, the divorce settlement processed, my professional reputation fully intact, and the knowledge that every attempt to undermine me, every scheme and coordinated effort to manipulate truth, had been meticulously documented and neutralized, leaving Belle with only the reality of her choices and the consequences they had wrought, a narrative fully exposed and incapable of distortion. And even as news of the proceedings filtered through mutual acquaintances, I felt no satisfaction in schadenfreude, only relief that justice, calm reasoning, and strategic patience had prevailed. And slowly, the domestic sphere reclaimed its purpose, the kitchen table for quiet breakfasts rather than confrontations, the living room for reading rather than contemplation of betrayal, the bedrooms for peace rather than planning or surveillance. And with Natalie by my side, these spaces became infused with warmth, lightness, and the possibility of laughter that required no filter, no performance, only presence. And I recognized that the most profound victories are often invisible to outsiders, maintaining dignity, securing truth, preserving personal integrity, and safeguarding what truly matters from chaos. And as evening settled, the sun casting golden light through the blinds, I sipped my coffee and allowed the enormity of freedom to sink in. Freedom not just from a failed relationship, but from manipulation, from the anxiety of uncertainty, from the constant need to prove oneself, understanding fully that the past, with all its lessons, would remain a reference, not a tether, and I could finally embrace a future defined not by what had been taken or lost, but by what could be built, nurtured, and shared, with clarity, peace, and the certainty that my life, my home, and my choices belonged entirely to me. The final chapter not one of vengeance, but of restoration, self-respect, and the quiet, enduring strength that comes from surviving, learning, and moving forward.